Today, if you go to a museum or a historical site, after viewing priceless works of art and irreplaceable pieces of history, you're almost certainly to be directed to go through a gift shop while you buy something, well, less than priceless. And of course, gift shops aren't unique to museums. You also find them at zoos, amusement parks, really all over the place. They can be full of all sorts of things, everywhere from this piece of teak wood from the deck of the USS Iowa to, I don't know, mass-produced junk. And despite their relatively cheap nature, it's not exactly a small business. According to the website Statista, in 2022, the U.S. market alone in souvenirs was $21 billion. It's human nature to try to preserve memories, and one of the ways that we do that is to buy keepsakes, mementos, reminders of where we've been, and evidence of this instinct goes back farther than you might think, long before anybody was asked to exit through the gift shop. The human desire to bring something back home when they travel afar is deep-seated, although it's difficult to identify what the first souvenir might be. It seems likely that people who traveled afield in the distant past carried with them mementos of their travel, but what qualifies as a souvenir rather than a trade good is difficult to identify in the archaeological record. The word souvenir comes from French. Its first appearance around 1100 meant something in one's memory, according to the Souvenir Project, and later as a verb meaning to recall or remind. Its modern usage, meaning something that serves as a reminder, comes in 1676. It wasn't until 1775 that it first appeared in English, attributed to Horace Walpole in a letter where it was used to mean memories. Within a decade, it was used in its modern definition, but items that were unambiguously created or sold as mementos have ancient roots as well. Among the candidates for the first souvenir are a handful of enameled vessels naming forts along Hadrian's Wall, dated circa 130 AD. These include the Rudge Cup, discovered in Wiltshire in 1725, the Amiens Patera, discovered in Amiens, France in 1949, the Staffordshire Moorlands Pan, discovered in 2003, and the recently discovered Berlenga Cup from Spain. No doubt they were made for the army on the wall, Jacques Hirgan wrote of the Amiens Petra in 1951, and the soldiers were pleased to take them back in their baggage when they went home. It isn't entirely clear that they were souvenirs in a classic sense. Were they purchased by the soldiers as mementos of their service or given as retirement gifts? They were cast and therefore may have been produced in large numbers. The Roman world, however, had other souvenirs that will seem very familiar. Except for the very wealthy, Roman citizens didn't generally travel for pleasure, but they did travel for business, for trade, and in service to the army. Others traveled for service serving in the administrations of the far-off territories. Ernst Kunzel, in the book The First Souvenirs, notes that at famous places like Athens, Ephesus, and Alexandria, Roman tourists could buy the same souvenirs we still do. Small-scale copies of famous statues, glasses decorated with waterfront pictures of tourist sites, miniature portraits of celebrities, and more. Indeed, even without modern methods of mass production, replicas of famous statues and sites were created in large quantities. This included perfume bottles modeled after Tish of Antioch. Tish was the guardian deity of Antioch, and the statue of her was emblematic of the city. Some of these were made in Antioch, but they were produced elsewhere as well. A man from Antioch, buried in Messina in Sicily's epitaph, records him as a trader in Tishes. Covered in Kimberly Cassabury's Destinations in Mind and Maggie Popkin's Souvenirs and Experience in Ancient Rome, there were also glass flasks from the 3rd or 4th centuries discovered all over the empire that were engraved with a panorama of the towns of Baiae and Puteoli on the Bay of Naples. These flasks give us insight into how inhabitants of the empire sum up a city, something like how the Eiffel Tower or the Gateway Arch, Big Ben, or the Empire State Building symbolizes modern cities. The statue of Athena at the Parthenon in Athens was also popular, as was the statue of Aphrodite at Knidos. A writing stylus discovered in Roman London, dated to the 1st century, is inscribed, "I have come from the city. I bring you a welcome gift, with a sharp point." Souvenirs found a renaissance thanks to Christianity. Christianity soon became the dominant religion in the last centuries of the empire, and the concept of a pilgrimage to the Holy Land became common. Across history, visitors to impressive sites sought memories of them. In the case of religious pilgrims, this was driven in part by the idea that dirt, water, stones, or other items could serve as kind of relics and held some kind of mystical power. Seeking to prevent vandalism and destruction, guardians of those sites directed the desires of pilgrims into something more productive, selling souvenirs or secondary relics, especially tiny ampulla or pilgrim flasks sealed with water, dirt, or hallowed oil. In 570, a pilgrim from Italy to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre recorded that earth is brought to the tomb and put inside, and those who go in take some as a blessing. Another mentions oil blessed by the wood of the cross at Golgotha. Many years later, Canterbury water was sealed in small vessels, supposedly tinged with Thomas à Becket's blood, which was said to have healing properties. Pilgrimage took on a tourism vibe, with various shrines promoting themselves to travelers. By the 12th century, palm leaves were sold at stalls in Jerusalem. In Spain, scallop shells were associated with the shrine of St. James Major of Santiago de Compostela. Among the most common were pilgrim badges, generally cast in tin lead, intended to be worn on hats or clothing, like the charms of charm bracelets. They came in a variety of shapes, representing saints and their shrines. The sermon Veneranda Dies explains that the badges bore witness to the pilgrims' great labor, according to the book Souvenirs, From Roman Times to the Present Day by Godfrey Evans. The badges also helped fund the church. According to Evans, in 1466, 130,000 badges were sold at the Swiss monastery at Santa Maria within a fortnight. In 1207, Pope Innocent III even instructed archbishops to prohibit the sale of fake badges. These pilgrim badges are probably the first true example of mass-produced, cheap and popular souvenirs, similar to the modern era of fridge magnets, coffee mugs, shirts, and smashed pennies. Guidebooks also suggest that higher quality and more expensive works of cloth and gold were also available. At Santiago de Compostela, pieces of carved jet became popular. The shrine there saw 500,000 visitors a year at its height of popularity. After the mid-15th century, new techniques, especially woodcuts and other kinds of printing, opened new avenues for souvenirs. By the 1470s, Veronicas, or faces of Christ, supposedly showing the face of Christ on the handkerchief of St. Veronica, were being sold outside St. Peter's in Rome. Copper plates and illustrated lists of relics held by churches were also common, and the Middle Ages were full of hucksters selling relics of all kinds, such as splinters from the cross or the spear of Longinus, and glazed earthen bowls with images, the clay of the bowls mixed with dust and water from holy sites. In 1868, Joseph Marriott describes dust being collected in the chapel to make into small cups. This became even more refined in the 18th and 19th century, with earthenware, tea sets, and polychrome enamels produced abroad, like in England or the Netherlands, to be sold in places like Kevelaar in Germany. Large wooden models of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre with inlaid mother of pearl and bone, and models of the Cave of the Nativity in Bethlehem were also made. Altar and table crosses were common souvenirs, made locally in the Holy Land and often exported as well. Muslim pilgrims also bought memorabilia. The cloth textiles that cover the Kaaba in Mecca and the Prophet's tomb in Medina are periodically replaced, and pieces of the cloth were cut up and given to dignitaries and pilgrims. In the late Middle Ages and early modern period, artists made Hajj certificates, scrolls which held images of sites along the pilgrimage route. While religious souvenirs were common, secular ones appeared as well. It might surprise you that the word spa comes from a location, Spa, Belgium. Spa, site of mineral springs, became a tourist center beginning in the 16th century. Spa itself seems to have produced walking staffs, brushes, bellows, and large boxes. Other spas, modeled after the original, also sold wooden souvenirs, such as the Courtier Spa of Tunbridge Wells in Kent. In 1697, traveler Celia Fiennes discovered shops full of all sorts of toys, silver, china, milliners, and all sorts of curious wooden ware at Tunbridge Wells. In 1766, Thomas Benj Burr compared the Tunbridge Wells souvenirs to that of Spa, mentioning tea chests, dressing boxes, snuff boxes, punch ladies, and more, which were sold especially when a guest left, when it is customary for them to take Tunbridge fairings to their friends at home. Tunbridge was later known for mosaics of colored wood. Other spas sold similar crafts, from mugs and tumblers to porcelain and tableware. In Bohemia, functional glassware was popular, often decorated with images of the spas themselves. Glass souvenirs were made for the 1851 Glass Palace exhibition and the 1862 International exhibition. In the 17th and 18th centuries, there came the idea of the Grand Tour, where young men, especially from England, were sent to travel Europe as part of their formal education, although they were also undertaken by older people, and sometimes tours were taken more than once. Italy, with its connections to classical Rome, was the main destination. Travelers visited museums and saw the sights of great European cities. Often tourists would return with commissioned portraits, views of the cities they visited, and if possible, actual items from antiquity, or at least copies. Miniature copies of statues were common in the 18th and into the 19th century, cast with molds. Gem engravings like intaglios and cameos, engraved shells, and micro-mosaics made up of millimeter-sized pieces of glass were common purchases as well. Some of the earliest public museums appeared in the 17th and 18th centuries, like the Royal Armouries at the Tower of London, which opened in 1660, with large numbers, like the Uffizi Gallery in Florence or the Museum of the History of Riga and Navigation, among many more. One of the earliest in the U.S. was Charles Wilson Peale's Philadelphia Museum, opened in 1784. Moses Williams, a former slave of Peale's, used a Physianotrace machine at the museum to create cut paper silhouettes as souvenirs for guests. In the United States, one of the most influential events for souvenirs might seem macabre. In 1799, George Washington died. Washington had achieved an unheard-of reputation in life. In death, according to William Byrd, a curator emeritus at the Smithsonian, he achieved Godhead status. Visitors quickly made their way to Mount Vernon, seeking some connection to the legendary man. These pieces were often physical, chipped-off pieces of mantle or ivy sprigs. It wasn't just Washington's house that suffered either. People chipped off bits of Plymouth Rock and cut off pieces of White House upholstery. There were bricks from the houses at Appomattox, where Lee surrendered, pieces of the Connecticut Charter Oak, and cups made of trees from Gettysburg's famous peach orchard. Mark Twain criticized American tourists' propensity to destructive souvenir hunting in The Innocents Abroad. At the Sphinx, he wrote, one of our well-meaning reptiles, relic hunters, had crawled up there and was trying to break a specimen from the face of this most majestic creation the hand of man ever wrought. In Italy, the souvenir market propped up artists as the court spent less and less on art. In Naples, carvings of coral, tortoiseshell, limestone was popular in the late 19th century. In the 1830s, an English tourist complained about sellers waiting outside the city gates of Pozzuoli. These fellows plague you with medallions and coins and effigies and small bronze Greek-shaped pitchers and lamps, always antique, having been dug up themselves. At Naples, there's a regular factory of these modern antiques. Jewelry copied after ancient models, and models of cork were other options in the 19th century. Souvenirs were transformed in the 18th and 19th century when transfer printing was developed, which allowed copper plate engravings to be used to transfer images onto pottery and wares, enamels, and wood, now able to mass-produce items without meticulous hand painting and dramatically decreasing cost. Before the 19th century, the goods were largely for the wealthiest members of society, who were the same people who were doing most of the tourism. As the middle class formed in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, more people were able to travel, and they had money for souvenirs, which also grew cheaper. Photography and picture postcards soon overtook paintings as souvenirs and were incredibly popular in the latter half of the century. A boom in souvenirs took place, lasting from the middle 19th to the middle 20th century. New wares, cheaper and in bigger production runs enabled by the Industrial Revolution, began to be made. Cheap transfer-printed porcelain was especially popular. British firm Josiah Wedgwood and Company made souvenir plates for the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Crested china, or china decorated with coats of arms, became the most popular kind in the early 20th century. The 19th century also saw some of the first official souvenir shops at cultural institutions like museums. The calcography department of the Louvre was established in 1797, and it has conserved and printed from a collection of several thousand engraved copper plates and sold copies, according to the official website of the Great Palais Art Workshop. In England, museums began selling plaster casts of items in the collection, and from 1838 the British Museum included lists of available casts in the end papers of its catalogue. Electrotyping allowed the reproduction of metal objects like coins. At the end of the 19th century, a souvenir fad struck the United States: collectible silver spoons. The trend had its roots in Europe, where after the 15th century sets of 13 silver spoons depicting each of the apostles, with the 13th depicting Jesus or Mary. They became popular as baptismal present for godparents, especially in England and Germany. As with many souvenir trends, the Industrial Revolution made the spoons much easier and cheaper to produce, allowing intricate spoons to be made via stamping. In Europe, spoons were sold depicting cities and landmarks, and Americans brought them home, inspiring dozens of American firms to begin producing commemorative and souvenir spoons by the 1890s. Especially popular was an early spoon made by Daniel Lowe in 1891, which featured a witch symbolizing the Salem witch trials. Spoons were sold at the 1893 Columbian Exposition, which popularized the hobby. It remained popular in the United States until World War I, although it has never fully died out. At the Panama Pacific International Exposition, the Isthmian Canal Souvenir Company sold glass domes from the last trainload of direct taken from the bottom of the world-famous Culebra-Cut Panama Canal. And the U.S. amusement parks, beginning with Coney Island and expanding, were centers of souvenirs in the late 19th and 20th centuries. The driving force behind the modern gift shop and souvenir economy was twofold. Tourists were going to take souvenirs one way or another, and selling souvenirs could finance historical sites. While souvenirs have long been dismissed by academics, as Jamie Larkin notes in a 2016 article in Archaeology International, at historical sites and museums, souvenirs often allowed historians and curators to reproduce their collections visually with clear and concise commentaries, to extend the visual influence of their collections. In 1934, J.E. Barton suggested an educated public taste. Souvenirs in these cases are educational, serve the apparent psychological need for mementos, protect the sites from souvenir seekers, and help finance upkeep. The 20th century again saw enormous changes in technology and wealth. Tourism, often relegated only to the wealthiest members of society, began to come within reach of middle and working class families, especially after World War II and especially in the United States. New technologies and materials like plastic allowed mass production on unheard of scales. The market for mementos and memories drove the tourism industry worldwide, creating entire economies. In the 1960s and 70s, flexible magnets added a common new souvenir.
And of course, the number of things, the sheer variety of what might be sold as a souvenir is virtually limitless. Everything from cheap snow globes to, well, a fine pair of cufflinks, or maybe a reproduction of a historical artifact, or of course, t-shirts, mugs, cheap jewelry, gosh, all sorts of things. Some people prefer to buy more authentic things made by locals. Some locals make their living doing that, as anybody who's ever been to a popular tourist spot can well attest. And while what we collect might change, I think it's safe to say that souvenirs are one bit of history that's going to continue to persist. I think we can be sure that the first people to visit planets other than the Earth are going to bring back rocks and sand, not just for scientific purposes, but just to remind them where they've been. What's your favorite souvenir? Let us know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.